All right, so here we go. Where we left off, we were talking about how populations grow. They grow, at least in the beginning, in what's called exponential growth, which is a way of saying that they double within a fixed time. So if you start out with two bunny rabbits, in a certain length of time, you'll have four, and then in another length of time, you'll have eight, and then in another length of time, you have 16, 32, 64, and so on. But that can't be sustained in nature. And eventually, a population will grow until it begins leveling off and reaches a quantity called the carrying capacity. At the carrying capacity, reproduction does not stop. The animals and plants are still reproducing, whenever they get the opportunity. But at the carrying capacity, this is the point where deaths in the population balance the births, where as many organisms are dying from predators, disease, parasites, lack of food, whatever it might be, as many are dying as are being born. And so the net growth of the population becomes zero. Populations can overshoot and then bust, come back down. Sometimes they can cycle around the carrying capacity. Lots of things can happen. In the case that we looked at of the Canadian lynx preying on snowshoe hares, neither population really did quite reach typical carrying capacity, simply because, if you remember, whenever the hare population got large, the lynx population grew because there was plenty of food. And then when the hare population fell, the lynx population also fell, and we get this oscillation, this boom and bust cycle, and neither population really reaches what can be said to be carrying capacity. So population size can be regulated by predators. It can also be regulated by more subtle factors. Plants in a forest don't look like they're competing. The maples are not forming a union to fight with the oak trees. The sweet gums are not punching each other. They're not ents. But there is only a fixed amount of energy available per unit of surface area. There's only so much sunlight available in a forest. And trees that grow tall absorb sunlight and can block it from reaching shorter plants. Shorter plants either will die out or they have to adapt to make do with less light. You may never have been in a forest that has truly been around for hundreds of years. There's not a lot of what we call old growth left, but it's like walking into a cathedral. It's surprisingly dark on the forest floor because the trees are absolutely huge. Here's a view out in the Mojave Desert of the Southwest US. This is actually Death Valley. The plants that you're seeing are creosote bushes, and you'll notice that there's a completely bare zone around each creosote bush. They almost look like they've been evenly planted. And the reason is these things have absolutely humongous roots, much bigger than the above ground part of the plant. And they're so efficient at getting water that nothing else can compete. So plants may compete for available water. There's only so much. And here the creosote bush has basically won. Plants may compete for sunlight. There can be lots of forms of competition, not necessarily involving killing and eating each other. The last thing I should mention is that the carrying capacity of an environment is not truly fixed. Things can happen that increase it or decrease it. And in particular, an organism can modify the carrying capacity of its own environment by its own activities. And there's examples like When plants grow and drop their leaves, decaying leaves in a typical forest actually go back into the soil and may ultimately increase the soil's fertility and make it possible for more plants to grow than otherwise could be. But humans are far and away the best at modifying the carrying capacity of their own environments. Um, in what's called the Green Revolution, over the past few hundred years, but specifically the Green Revolution took place since the 1960s, new farming methods and improved crops, often by artificial selection, if you remember that, have increased the world food supply dramatically over the past few hundred years. Um, and this is one reason why the Earth's population has grown large. Humans are actually able to do things that increase the carrying capacity of the human population in most parts of the world. Everything from artificial fertilizers to high yield, pest resistant, genetically modified crops. On the other hand, in some parts of the world, the carrying capacity is getting pulled down. In fact, because of inefficient farming methods, since 1945, we've lost about 10% of our fertile topsoil globally. Often that's due to, erosion happens whether we're around or not, but a lot of this has been due to human activity, specifically to inefficient farming methods that don't conserve topsoil. That pulls the carrying capacity down. One place you can see this is a belt of dry grasslands running across northern Africa called the Sahel, south of the Sahara Desert, running from Eritrea, and you can tell this is an old map because Sudan is now divided into Sudan and South Sudan, running across Chad and Niger all the way here to I think that's Mali. I get Mali and Mauritania confused. Sorry. And because of overgrazing by livestock and poor irrigation, plus the fact there's not much water there anyway, 3,900 square miles of the Sahel becomes desert every year. That's about equivalent to 6 Arkansas counties every year. And that drops the carrying capacity for the human populations in the Sahel, in countries like Mali, Chad, Niger. The human population tends to rise, but the ability of that human population to support itself has been going down. And as a result, you have a lot of people that are leaving the land and flocking to cities. And that creates various social problems, which we don't have time to solve in this class, but that certainly do need to be addressed. Right. So, given that we have organisms in an environment, they tend to evolve over time, and they tend to evolve different life histories. And a life history is kind of like a living thing's budget. If you are a smart financial planner, and I hope you are, because you're supposed to learn financial literacy now, you have a budget and you decide how much money you allocate each month towards food, how much towards lodging, your rent or whatever it is, how much towards clothing, how much towards gasoline, how much towards Netflix, or whatever it is that you do. Living things are acted upon by natural selection, and they tend to evolve towards particular life histories, which are also sort of like budgets. Given that an organism only has a finite amount of energy, how much should it spend on feeding? How much should it spend on reproducing? How much should it spend resting? If you're wondering how predators manage to live such an intense lifestyle, the answer is that they don't. They sleep an awful lot. Your cat sleeping for 20 hours a day is basically what it would be doing naturally as a wild creature. And in particular, how much should you spend on reproducing? If you don't reproduce, you die, but some strategies for reproducing are better than others. As far as reproduction goes, organisms tend to evolve one of two life history strategies, although you can find lots of in-betweens. These are the ends of a scale, not an either-or classification. Organisms can evolve towards either an R-selected or a K-selected life history. I should mention R is that intrinsic rate of increase and K is carrying capacity. R-selected life history organisms tend to maximize R. They tend to increase the population as rapidly as possible. They'll produce many, 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 many offspring, but very little parental investment in each one. Lots and lots of babies. There's no ability to invest a great deal of energy in each. And investment can mean things like parental care, but it could also mean things like the amount of nutrients you put in the eggs so that the embryos can develop, special things you do caring for offspring, like, hard shells of a seed or something like that. All of the energy that goes into reproducing is energy investment. And organisms with an R-selected life history maximize the raw number of offspring, but can't invest much in each one. And as a consequence, most of the offspring die. In K-selected organisms, you have very few offspring, but high investment of parental energy in each one. Most of the dying takes place among older members of the population. So here's a couple of R-selected organisms. They're oysters, and both of them look like they're surrounded by smoke. That smoke is countless millions of eggs and sperm being released freely into the water, as oysters like doing when there's a full moon out and it's summer. A female oyster can crank out something on the order of 100 million eggs a year. And if she's not fished up out of the water and deep fried or served on the half shell, she might actually live for 20 years. And the male can produce a like number of sperm. If all of those 100 million offspring every year survived, the oceans would be full. There would be no room for the water because there'd be just nothing but freaking oysters everywhere. And we don't see that happening, of course. Oyster populations tend to be more or less stable. And this means that the vast majority of those fertilized eggs never make it to adulthood. There's 100 million babies every season. Maybe 2 or 3 will end up growing into adults. The vast majority either get eaten by something else, or they get attacked by germs, or there's not enough food for them to live, or there's no place for them to settle down. The overwhelming majority of oysters die before they ever get large enough to eat. That's a very strongly R-selected species. Humans are a terrific example of a K-selected species. We don't have 100 million offspring. We can't. We're rather limited in the number of offspring that we're capable of having. Even the Duggars kind of topped out at what was it, 19, I think. There's simply limits to how many babies a woman is capable of having. On the other hand, we invest an enormous amount of energy in each offspring. Pregnancy is a major investment of energy. And if you don't believe me, try walking around all day with a watermelon strapped to your belly. Nursing takes it out of you because your body needs energy to produce that milk. Someone worked out that a woman who's nursing twins is burning as much energy as a soldier in basic training is burning energy. It takes it out of you. Childcare certainly takes it out of you. Um, especially, paying for $160 in expenses that your kid ran up on Roblox without telling you, that really takes it out of you too. Um, Even in cultures where you don't have to pay for Roblox, humans invest much more energy in every offspring, and that begins before birth, through nursing, and then after that through other forms of childcare until the kid is old enough to go out and flip burgers and get a damn job and start helping out around the house and all that. And remember that when we think of parental investment, we think of human style parental care, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like dandelions are selected because they produce lots of seeds, but the seeds are pretty small and they don't contain a lot of energy. And a lot of those seeds are just going to blow away and, end up on a footpath or on rocks or something like that. Something like a coconut would be K selected, not because coconuts care for their babies, but, in the way that humans do, but coconuts do put enormous amounts of energy into every seed in the form of the coconut milk and the coconut meat. That's nutrition for the baby coconut plant. We eat it, but that's not what it's there for. It's there because the parents are investing a great deal of energy into giving every seed the best possible start in life that it can. And again, you can have in betweens. It's not like every organism is either R or K selected. These are the ends of a scale we can use. Okay, right. Living things evolve particular life history strategies, living in specific environments that they're in. Um, every species has the strategy that it does and the features that it does because it evolved to live in a certain place and not in other places. Fish look the way they do because they evolved to live in the ocean, not on mountaintops. And to define what we mean a little more precisely, we can say that every species has a set of conditions under which it can survive, reproduce, and the population can grow. We call those conditions the species niche. Or as someone once said, life's a niche and then you die. And if you want to see a niche about this time of year, go to, socially distanced and masked, your nearest garden store, the garden section of the big hardware stores, Lowe's or Home Depot, or the plant outlet out on Hogan Road, what a buy, or wherever your local garden store is. Many of the plants will come with tags that tell you where to plant it, that say something like, requires full sun, water once a week, or does best in partial shade, fertilize with extra nitrogen and phosphorus, water twice a day until established, or something like that. Those descriptions of where the plant should be planted and how to care for it, you can think of as that plant's niche. It's the set of conditions under which that plant will thrive. If you don't give it that set of conditions, you'll end up with a very expensive bundle of sticks growing out of your yard. Ask me how I know this. That's the niche. Competition results when you have two species, two populations living in the same area and their niches overlap. And niche overlap is just a way of saying that the two populations are using the same resources. So that if we have, expensive heirloom tomato plants and chickweed growing in the same garden, They're growing in the same garden. They're using the same light. They're taking the same water and nutrients out of the soil. They're using the same niche. And so there's competition between them. And one or the other will eventually start winning out. And knowing my luck, it will probably be the expensive tomatoes and not the chickweed. There's a difference, by the way, between a fundamental niche, which is the set of conditions under which a species is able to grow, and its realized niche, which is the conditions under which it actually does grow, given that there are competitors. I'll show you an example of that in just a bit. If you have two populations sharing a niche, one of two things will happen. One population can drive the other to extinction, and we call that competitive exclusion. The other possibility is resource partitioning, which means that organisms will evolve in such a way that they don't overlap so much. And I always like to explain this by imagining that you wake up one morning and you find that the town of Vilonia, Arkansas, through some kind of strange cosmic coincidence, all of a sudden has 20 shoe stores. Now, Vilonia is what, maybe 5,000 people or so, something like that. I forget how many, but it's not really the kind of place where you need 20 shoe stores. You know, there's not enough people in Vilonia buying shoes to keep 20 stores in business. So one of two things would happen if you woke up and there were 20 shoe stores all in Vilonia. One is that many of them would go out of business. There would be competition between those shoe stores. They would all be competing for the relatively small number of people in Vilonia that want to buy shoes on any given day. Many of the stores would be outcompeted and forced to close. That would be competitive exclusion. If you're trying to sell shoes and the store next door has the same shoes for $1 less, then you'll either have to drop your prices or you end up going out of business. So that would be competitive exclusion. Resource partitioning, or niche partitioning, as you'll also see it called, would be like one of our shoe stores in Vilonia decides to specialize in work boots and, industrial type wear. And one of our shoe stores decides to specialize in athletic footwear. And one of our shoe stores decides to specialize in dress shoes and, fancy shoes. Dress shoes, shoes you wear with a business suit, 12-inch stiletto heels, things like that. That would be a case of resource partitioning because the stores aren't competing so much anymore. The people that need to buy work boots are not, well, they could be, but they're not necessarily the same as the people who are in the market for 12-inch stiletto heels. I guess some people would have a need to buy both. I'm not saying they wouldn't, but the point is that the overlap between those customer bases is a lot smaller. And so what the shoe stores have essentially done is taken the set of people who want to buy shoes and divided them up, and each one is catering to a different set of shoe customers. I think they call that market segmentation in economics. It's called resource partitioning over here. This was a study done in 1931 by a Russian guy named Gauss. He took populations of two species of single-celled protist that look like this. They're pretty large single-celled organisms, about 100 microns each. They're called Paramecium aurelia on the left and Paramecium caudatum on the right. They look pretty similar, but it's still pretty possible to tell them apart, and they both feed. They feed on bacteria. And when he grew them separately, He'd start with a few paramecium in a test tube, and the population would grow and grow, and then it would level off and it would reach carrying capacity, as we've seen. But when both of them were in the same test tube, Aurelia would grow and grow and dominate, and Caudatum would go down to ultimate extinction. I mean, not global extinction, just extinction within that test tube. But Aurelia, for whatever reason, was just slightly better at getting food than Caudatum was. And Caudatum, you see, would grow for a little while, but it just couldn't make headway against Aurelia, which was just a little bit better. And so Caudatum ended up dying out in the test tube. But if you want to see neat examples of niche partitioning, here's one. Down below, you've got diagrams of fir trees, conifer, Christmas trees, trees bearing cones, growing up in Canada. And I think this was a guy named Robert May, discovered that you had 3 species of bird all living in the same trees. But they didn't actually compete with each other that much because, first of all, they lived in different parts of the same tree. So you'd get Cape May warblers living at the top, and bay-breasted warblers in the middle, and yellow-rumped warblers in the bottom. And they not only used different space, they were feeding on different insects. These are insect-eating birds. So they had somewhat different diets. They were occupying different parts of the tree. They didn't compete with each other much because they had partitioned that niche. So this would be like the 3 shoe stores in Valonia, one selling work boots and one selling athletic shoes and one selling dress shoes. They're not competing with each other that much. Now, I mentioned earlier there was a distinction between a fundamental niche and a realized niche, and this was worked out in some really neat experiments in the 1960s on the coast of Washington State, where the coast tends to be quite rocky. And on rocky coastlines in the Pacific, some of the dominant organisms are called barnacles. Each one of these little bumpy things is an individual barnacle. So that right there is a barnacle. And right next to it, that's another barnacle. They look a little bit like volcanoes. There's a barnacle. That's a barnacle. That's a barnacle, and so on. They're animals. And believe it or not, they are related to shrimp and crabs. They're crustaceans. What happens is they'll swim around looking a little bit like baby shrimp for a while when they're juveniles, and then glue their heads to a rock, grow this cone-shaped shell around themselves, and spend the rest of their lives using extremely elongated legs to sweep through the water and sweep food particles into their mouths. So they start out looking like baby shrimp. They just develop in a rather odd way as adults. And once a barnacle has glued itself to a rock, it can never leave. They're permanently attached. And so every new generation of barnacles, the larvae have to find a place where they can settle down. And there's 2 species of barnacles that live permanently attached to rocks, a big one called Balanus, genus Balanus. I forget the species name, it's not important here, and a smaller species called Cathamalus. Here's the thing, where they both live together, Balanus is bigger, and Balanus can grow faster than Cathamalus. So if you put a Balanus and a Cathamalus together, the Balanus can grow right on top of Cathamalus and wipe it out. However, Cathamalus can survive for longer out of the water, and so it lives on higher rocks. On those rocky coastlines, the high rocks, the ones that are farthest away from the water, might only get splashed, and that might only happen a few times a day. The lower down you go, the wetter it tends to get. And so in the low intertidal zone, Balanus can outcompete Cathamalus, but in the upper intertidal zone, Balanus dries out and Cathamalus can survive. And that was the point of the fundamental versus realized niche. If you remove all of the Balanus, Cathamalus can survive all through this zone. That's its fundamental niche. That's where it's able to live if you remove Balanus. Its realized niche is only this upper zone because it's kept out of the middle zone right here by competition with Balanus. So Cathamalus is capable of living all through this wider zone, but where it has competition from Balanus, it only is able to live in this narrow zone. This is the fundamental niche, and this would be the realized niche, the zone of rocks where Cathamalus can live. So yeah, Cathamalus has a fundamental niche of the upper and middle zone. That's its fundamental niche, but its realized niche is the upper zone only because in the lower zone, it gets outcompeted by Balanus. Okay, great. So we've talked about, we're getting into where we're talking about ecosystems. Let's talk about how they change over time. And I don't mean evolutionary time, I mean changing from year to year. You can see this around here if you look at a vacant lot or a plowed field that's been abandoned. If you were to plow up your front lawn and then just leave it, first you'd start getting small weeds growing there, seeds that maybe blew in like dandelion seeds or washed in or got carried on animal fur like, cockleburs and things like that. The small weeds would grow there first. Within not very long, you'd have a pretty weedy field. And then taller plants would grow. Those take longer to grow, but once they are tall, they start shading out the little weeds. So you'd get tall grasses. Given enough time, with more seeds being brought in, you'd end up with shrubs and small trees. And those would start to outcompete the weeds and the tall grasses. The trees would get bigger and bigger, and eventually you would end up in a dense forest where the tall trees were sucking up so much sunlight that not much could grow underneath them at all. And you'd go through these series of pretty predictable stages, and we call those predictable stages ecological succession, where one ecosystem or one community gets replaced by another one as time goes by. So if we're talking about forest, for example, it might take centuries, but we could end up with something like what we have at Muir Woods, California, which everybody should visit. It's a forest of coastal redwood trees that get over 300 feet tall. And you can walk in and among these enormous trees that are, we talk about people being tree huggers. You can't hug these because they are, 10, 15 feet, 3, 4, 5 meters wide at the base, maybe bigger than that. They're huge. And they're big enough that there's not a whole lot growing on the forest floor around them because they're so good at taking water and absorbing light. That's a climax community where succession comes to an end. And an old growth forest like that should persist indefinitely unless it burns down or people come and log it or something like that. So that's the climax community is the end of ecological succession. We can sometimes distinguish between primary and secondary succession because primary succession takes place in a location where there's never been life. Secondary succession, you're not completely starting from square zero because there has been life in the area. So here's primary succession. That's a volcano erupting out of the sea off the coast of Iceland in 1963. It's called Surtsey, island of the fire giant, basically. And it erupted it had been building for centuries below the surface, but 1963 is when it erupted above the surface and erupted lots of ash and lava for about a year. And when it formed, it was practically sterile. There are extremophiles out there, but even they can't live in lava. So the molten lava and the scalding ash pouring out of the earth that formed Surtsey were, for all practical purposes, devoid of any life at all. What happened was, and scientists have been able to watch this, Surtsey is monitored very carefully by Icelandic scientists, and most people aren't allowed to visit. And what they've seen is, first of all, you have wind-blown plant seeds that blow over from the mainland. And of course, you have, insects get blown over from the mainland. Spiders do. Remember, some spiders can spin a little bit of silk that enables them to catch the wind and go sailing. So spiders can have reached Surtsey by ballooning. Insects get blown over. Seabirds, of course, can fly right over and settle down. What they've also seen is things like trees from the Iceland mainland that erode and fall into rivers, wash out to sea. And they've actually observed this. Sometimes they wash up on Surtsey, and sometimes those have soil still stuck to the roots. And those can bring not just insects, but earthworms and mosses and things like that. So last I looked, there were over 60 plant species growing on Surtsey, 15 species of birds, spiders and insects had made it across, even slugs had made it across to Surtsey. So what we're seeing is a case of primary ecological succession, where we're starting with absolutely barren habitat that gets colonized by migrants from the nearest mainland and is still in early stages of succession here. When we're talking about secondary succession, that refers to succession in a region that's been disturbed but has never been completely void of life. That's an abandoned farm field. A great example is, I know you've been there, the prairie part of the UCA Nature Reserve. You might remember that what maintains that as prairie is the fact that we burn it on a regular basis. In fact, some burning is going to be taking place in there this summer, I found out. But the burning does not completely destroy all life in that prairie. There's always things that survive, and there's always unburned parts of the prairie. And there's always seeds that can grow back once the burning has happened. You might have remember this from lab. The prairie part of the nature reserve used to be the hay field back when that part of campus was a working farm. And that means they mowed it, but they never plowed it, which means that prairie soil is still there. There's a very distinctive type of prairie soil, prairie vegetation and that was never disturbed. So or that was never destroyed the way plowing would do. So that patch of prairie has been disturbed, but it's never been completely sterilized. It was never cemented over or anything like that. So what we see there is secondary succession. And our selected organisms tend to be the first to appear in succession because once some habitat is open, it's the R selected ones that are cranking out lots of offspring so they can spread rapidly and gain a very quick foothold. So the small weeds, or in some cases, the beautiful wildflowers, as here, this is white coneflower. They tend to reproduce quickly. They get a rapid foothold. They're able to spread into all parts of the habitat. And then later they tend to get replaced by K-selected species, which take longer to reproduce, but invest more in each offspring. So grasses and wildflowers like that, given enough time, will tend to get replaced by trees. Here's the thing, the thing of what makes prairie is that it's constantly being disturbed. If you left a patch of prairie completely alone, then eventually those grasses and those flowers would get replaced by shrubs, and the shrubs would get replaced by trees, and the trees would grow bigger and bigger and shade out more and more of the smaller plants, and we'd end up with old growth forest. Now, not that there's anything wrong with old growth forest, but what makes prairie is that prairie is periodically subject to fire. Wildfire in nature, it would be lightning strokes. Native Americans were known to deliberately set prairie fires because they were managing their own habitat. And then now in the nature reserve, we have to burn the prairie every few years to keep it prairie. Prairies periodically burn off. And again, they're deliberately burned by managers to keep them from becoming forest. In nature, if there were no managers, if there were no people, what Arkansas would look like would be patches of prairie mixed with patches of trees. And every patch of prairie would eventually grow into forest, but forest would periodically burn down and they'd start over as prairie again. So we'd end up with this kind of balance between forest and prairie. But the point of prairie is that it never reaches that climax state. The last thing, I know we just hit 1050. This is an ecosystem that you'll see a lot of in Central California. This is what the Bay Area looks like, where it hasn't been built up and covered with Starbucks and Google. It's called chaparral, and it's a distinctive mixture of grasses with short, scrubby, shrub-like oaks and pines and things like that. And it also doesn't naturally reach the climax community because it also is adapted to periodically burning down. Chaparral species can recover from wildfires very quickly. A lot of them have fire-resistant seeds or deep fire-resistant roots, and so they can spring right back. The problem comes when you repress chaparral wildfires. And the reason why you'd want to do that is, this is, to me, it's chaparral. To some Californians, it's prime real estate. And I remember this very well because I was a grad student at University of California, Berkeley at the time. This is the Oakland firestorm of October 1991 that got to less than a mile from where I was living. This was a chaparral fire that broke out in an area where wildfire had been suppressed all this time. There was lots of dead and dry vegetation, so lots of fuel for the fire. And the fire spread so rapidly and got so big, the smoke drifted across the bay and drifted into the World Series game that was being played at what we used to call Candlestick Park. And I think forced the cancellation of the game. It got so smoky. 25 people died, 3,000 homes were destroyed. This is what happens when you start messing with, environments that never reach climax because they're adapted to periodic burning off. What people do now is controlled burns. Also, they use a lot of goats, which are very good at eating vegetation before it can build up enough to cause another catastrophic fire. But these are the things you have to know about if you're going to live in certain environments, like the Bay Area of California. Not that I'll ever live there again because I can't afford it. Right. I will now stop.